If you wish to follow with me, I'm turning to John chapter 11 and using yet a fourth text. I'm reading from a very familiar account. It starts at John 11, verse 32. And when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. It was called the Centennial Safe. And it was part of the celebration of America's 100th birthday. The year was 1876. The place was Philadelphia, the birthplace of our country. And that was also serving as the site in 1876 for a World's Fair. On display at the World's Fair were all of America's latest discoveries and inventions. It was there at the Philadelphia World's Fair that Alexander Graham Bell first showed off his first telephone. It was there that Heinz ketchup was introduced. And it was there in 1876 that attendees at that fair could climb up the torch arm of the Statue of Liberty, because it had not yet been assembled in New York Harbor. And this Centennial Safe was also one of the exhibits. It was a cast iron, fireproof, airtight safe, 5 feet tall, 4 feet wide, that was intended to become a kind of time capsule. Time capsule. It was a time in which Americans had discovered the ability to preserve things. Photographs. You could preserve how people look at a particular moment in their life. Photographs now becoming more common, more affordable, more available, more accessible. Embalming. The preserving of the human body. Remember, it was in the Civil War that this technique was learned so that the bodies of slain soldiers could be returned home to their families so they could see them one last time before burial. And so there's this idea of preserving. And so they were going to preserve stuff in this sort of time capsule, in this centennial safe that was not intended to be reopened until America's bicentennial in 1976. So what do you think, folks, what do you think Americans would have put in a safe like that? What do you think they would have saved? Maybe a rare original copy of the Declaration of Independence, of which we still can only account for 26 of the original 200. Do you think that maybe they would have included in the safe maybe an unpublished poem written by Abraham Lincoln himself? Do you think they would have put in something like exciting like that? Well, they didn't. They put in a bunch of photographs and a bunch of autographs of Americans who were famous at the time. That's what they put in there. And so, when 1976 came, 100 years later, somebody was able to find this centennial safe and decided, hey, this thing's due to be open now. They brought it to the U.S. Capitol building, and it was July of 1976, and they were going to have a ceremony, and the people were invited, and news journalists were invited to come and take part in the ceremony of the opening of this safe. And President Gerald Ford was brought over from the Oval Office out of his busy schedule. He was brought over to make a speech, and he made a nice speech about how the treasure, the true treasure of America cannot be found in some vault or safe. The true treasure of America is America's heritage and its freedom. And then after the speech, they opened the safe, and they began to bring out these items, photographs and autographs, things that by 1976 are just really just pretty common. And so the response of the audience gathered that day was to laugh. They laughed as these things were brought out. It was just dead, boring, an absolute waste of time. Is that how we also see suffering? Isn't it a waste of time? Isn't the time that we spend in suffering and grief, isn't it just wasted time? Isn't it just a big waste of time? Days spent in tears that could have been spent in happiness. Grieving the loss of a loved one gone too soon. And we consider the suffering out in the world, war and earthquakes and human trafficking and hunger. And all of this is still going on while we wait for all things to come to completion, as we wait for Jesus' return. All these things keep on going. In one of his novels, James Runcie, the author, causes one of his main characters to ask the question, why would a loving God permit such monumental suffering as the bombing of the cities of Europe in World War II? What purpose did it serve? What about the cities in Japan, too? Makoto Fujimura tells a story about his grandfather. He was a bit of a science man. He was a man of science who was asked to go to the city of Hiroshima after it had been bombed by the atomic bomb. He was a man of science who taught science, and so he was asked by the Japanese government to go to Hiroshima and assess the damage. Can you imagine having that job? According to family history in the Fujimura family, his grandfather could never bring himself to speak of what he saw. And, in fact, though he had been a devoted Christian, it seemed as if for a long time after, he lost his faith. Isn't suffering wasted time? Just a waste of time. I have been reading a book written by Makoto Fujimura titled Art and Faith. And it is about faith. And Fujimura is definitely a man after his grandfather's own heart. Like his grandfather, he too is a devoted Christian man. He is also a Japanese American. His family obviously from Japan, but he was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1960, making him just 2 years younger than I am. And he has been his whole adulthood, he's been a very successful, very, very successful artist and painter. And in his book, Art and Faith, he talks about art, he talks about faith, and he devotes a good part of the book to talk about suffering, especially in light of the passages in John chapter 11, my text, and John chapter 12, all about the raising of Lazarus and the response to that raising. And in the book, Fujimura especially focuses in on that part in John 11 that I read to you a moment ago. Mary is there at the tomb of her brother. She is weeping, and Jesus begins to weep with her. And Fujimura asked the question, weren't those tears of Jesus just a waste of time? He compares the tears of Jesus there to the perfume that this same Mary would pour out upon Jesus later, just a few days after the raising of Lazarus. She pours out this perfume, this expensive, uncut nard. Uncut. It hadn't been cut with anything. It was just pure, expensive, one of the most expensive perfumes you could buy at the time. She pours it out upon him, and the response of Judas, we are told in John chapter 12, the response of Judas was basically implying that it was a waste. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He says the pouring out of that perfume on Jesus was a waste. And by comparison, Fujimura asked the question, weren't Jesus' tears at the tomb of Lazarus a waste? After all, when Jesus came to the tomb, he knew what was going to happen. He knew that God was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. So why not get on with it? Why prolong the grieving? Why prolong the suffering? Why prolong the tears? What a waste. Was this also Mary's response to Jesus' tears? How did Mary respond to Jesus' tears at the tomb of her brother? And was Mary's response something different? A different experience of faith in regards to and in response to suffering. How did Mary respond? For her response, we go to John chapter 12. It's in the next, as I alluded to already. It was at a dinner, probably held in Lazarus' honor. And there she takes that expensive perfume and she pours it out upon Jesus. That was her response. That was her response to the whole ordeal of Jesus' tears and her tears and the raising of her brother. Her response was that of pouring out this expensive perfume upon Jesus. And when we read the same account in Mark's version of it, both Mark and John telling this account as being only a few days before Jesus' crucifixion. In the Mark's telling of it, it wasn't just Judas who said it was a waste. It says there were a number of people there at that dinner who said, this perfume, wasn't it wasted? And Jesus said, leave her alone. What she has done for me is a beautiful thing. It's not all that Jesus says there, and I think maybe that these words kind of get lost in all the other wonderful words that Jesus says there in that account in Mark chapter 14. But this is significant. Jesus says, what she has done for me is beautiful. Beautiful. Not a waste. Because when we realize that it was only a couple of days after that Jesus would go to the cross, when you think about what kind of perfume this was, imagine today buying a perfume worth $50,000. That's not eau de cologne, is it? That's not just some lilac water. That's something that will stay on you. It'll linger. And when Jesus went to the cross to bear our iniquities, to bear our brokenness, to bear our suffering, to carry our sorrows, when everything else was taken from him, everything, every bit of clothing taken from him, everything taken from him, the only thing he had left was the scent of that expensive perfume that was still on him. It was the only thing he took with him to the cross. This thing that was to prepare him for burial, he said. This thing that anointed him as Lord of all, crowned as king over all. It wasn't a waste. It wasn't a waste. Jesus was saying that what Mary gave him was beautiful. And this was her response to his tears. It was beautiful. Fujimura has taken that and used a metaphor to explain it, the beautiful thing that Mary did. He has taken it and compared it to an ancient Japanese art form, that of kintsugi. If you're familiar with kintsugi, you know it has to do with tea ware. And of course, Japanese tea ceremony is a big thing. It's a big thing in Japanese culture. And we experienced it also when we were in Japan back in 2018, visiting our youngest son. So they've got these really fancy cups and the pitcher for pouring the tea. It's expensive stuff. It's expensive porcelain. So what happens if you break one of those teacups? If you drop one accidentally and it breaks, what do? Just throw it away? No, that's expensive stuff. You bring those broken pieces to the master kintsugi artist, and he uses gold, real gold, and Japanese lacquer to put the pieces back together again. But not in order to make something once more useful. No. The teacup he puts back together again is even more beautiful than it had been before. It's brand new. It's been transfigured. It's been transformed. And Fujimura says that's what the master artist, God himself, our creator, does through our suffering. He puts the broken pieces back together again. Transfigures us. He uses our suffering to transfigure us, to change us into a new creation. Something beautiful. To live a beautiful life. To live a beautiful response. The kind of beautiful response that Mary had. Now you'd say, but her response was also to her brother's resurrection. If Jesus had not raised her brother, if it had just been left at that, Jesus' tears, and that's it, she still might have been angry with him and said, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I don't need your tears. Keep your damn tears. You got to keep the resurrection in mind, though, because the resurrection changes everything, doesn't it? The resurrection of her brother changed her response. And our response to suffering, it cannot help but be changed by the resurrection of Jesus. All of our suffering, all of our grief, all of our losses, we see through the resurrection of Christ. And isn't that what we believe about the resurrection? That God can take something that is broken, the broken body of a loved one, He can take that and transform it into something beautiful. That's what we're counting on, isn't it? So also does God do with our suffering even now while we still live. He takes the broken pieces of our lives, the broken pieces of our grief. He takes our tears and he mingles his own tears with them because Jesus lives. Jesus is resurrected and he lives. Does he not also grieve with us as he grieved with Mary? And so his tears commingle with our tears, and that becomes the gold that God uses to put us back together again, to transform us, so that through your brokenness and through your healing, that God's grace may shine through to other people. Now, each one of us can only speak for himself or herself. You can't really tell this to someone who's in the middle of grief. It's not fair. It's not fair to tell them how they're supposed to feel or what God is going to do with their suffering. But each one of us can speak for himself or herself. And I think that you and I both would say that we would not be who we are without also the suffering and grief we have gone through. The suffering and grief we have been through has also shaped who we have become. And I think we might even go so far to say is that because of the resurrection of Jesus, because of our faith, we would even go so far as to say that whatever suffering is still awaiting me in this life, it will it will be in there. God will use it to help me become what he wants me to become. Beautiful. Doing beautiful things. Living a beautiful life. Beautiful, not from the outside, but beautiful from the inside. And so our suffering, in answer to our first question, is not wasted time. Nor was the opening of the Centennial Safe in 1976. It wasn't really a waste of time. The people who were gathered that day, including President Ford, probably thought it was a waste of their time. But if they had looked a little more closely, I think they would have seen that, no, it wasn't. One of the things they pulled out of that Centennial Safe, that time capsule, one of the things they pulled out that day was an inkstand that had belonged to the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And that would have been significant for those who remembered Longfellow and remembered what Longfellow wrote, probably with the ink from that very inkstand, because Longfellow wrote the poem that's read hopefully still by all school children, because it goes back to the birth of our nation, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. He wrote that. You know, about the one if by land and two if by sea. He wrote those beautiful words that go back to the birth of our nation. And it was also Longfellow who came to be known at that time, around 1876, who came to be known as America's grief counselor. Longfellow had lost two wives. His second one, they were very close. She died in a tragic fire, and it broke him. And so a lot of the poetry he wrote after that was about grief and loss. But some of it is very beautiful. It addresses suffering and loss and faith and resurrection. Listen to these beautiful words that he wrote in a poem titled Auf Wiedersehen. He wrote, "Faith overleaps the confines of our reason. As by faith. And if by faith, then as in times of old, as it was said, women received their dead, raised up to life. Then our suffering is only for a season. Only for a season our partings are. Nor is our grief in vain until we meet again." He says that his grief for his wife was not in vain, his suffering not wasted. And it's because he believed in the resurrection. And we believe in the resurrection too. We believe that we will see our loved ones again. Yes, we are waiting. We are in a moment of waiting. We are in a season of waiting as we wait for Jesus' return and for all things to come to completion and for God to raise the dead, our loved ones, back to life. We're waiting for all of that, but it's not in vain. Our suffering is not in vain. God intends to use it to make us beautiful, like a kintsugi teacup. God intends to make us beautiful. Perhaps using our suffering to make us love Jesus more, or to love people more, including listening to others. What can we name that is more important of all the things that we do in our life, of all the things that we do with our lives, of all the things that we do with our time? What is more important than listening to others, especially those who suffer? Now that's not wasted time, is it? Amen.